It's 6:12 a.m. on a Tuesday in early February, and I'm standing in the parking lot of a building I spent 19 years keeping alive. The temperature is sitting around -18 with the wind chill. This is Edmonton, so that's not unusual. And I can see my breath hanging in the air like a question I don't know how to answer yet. I'm not here to fix anything. For the first time in almost 2 decades, that's not my job anymore. Let me back up. My name is Hugh. I'm 53 years old, and until about 6 weeks ago, I was the operations director for a mid-sized logistics and cold storage company called Northbridge Distribution. We moved temperature-controlled freight, pharmaceuticals, perishables, medical supplies across Alberta and into BC and Saskatchewan. At our peak, we were handling contracts worth close to $80 million annually. The Provincial Health Authority was one of our anchor clients. So were 3 of the largest grocery chains in Western Canada. I wasn't the flashiest person in the building. I didn't go to business school. I started as a dock supervisor in my early 30s, learned the software we used to manage cold chain compliance, learned the transport regulations, learned the quirks of every refrigeration unit we operated. Over time, I became the person who knew where every single vulnerability in our operation lived. Not because I was trying to be indispensable. I actually spent years trying to document everything, trying to cross-train people. But there was always a fire. There was always something more urgent. And so, quietly, without really meaning to, I became the load-bearing wall that nobody thought to look at. I had a good relationship with our founder, a guy named Earl who'd started the company out of a 2-truck operation in the 90s. Earl was the kind of man who remembered your kids' names and asked about them. He gave me my first real promotion. When his wife had her cancer scare in 2019, I picked up a lot of his slack without being asked. That's just how it worked between us. 19 years of that. Earl retired in the spring. He sold his majority stake to a private equity group out of Toronto called Meridian Capital Partners. They brought in a new CEO. A woman I'll call my new boss, because honestly, naming her feels like giving her more real estate in my head than she deserves. She was 38, had an MBA from Rotman, and had spent most of her career in retail consulting. She had never, not once in her professional life, managed temperature-controlled logistics. But she had slides. God, did she have slides. Her first month, she did a listening tour. I gave her 3 hours of my time, walked her through our compliance framework, our contingency protocols, our relationships with Transport Canada and the provincial cold chain auditors. She nodded a lot and took notes on an iPad. At the end, she said, "Hugh, I really appreciate the depth here. We're going to need to think about how we modernize some of this." I asked what she meant by modernize. She said, "Some of this feels very manual. Very relationship-dependent." I told her that relationships with regulators were actually a feature, not a bug in this industry. She smiled and said we'd circle back. That was September. By November, she had brought in a consulting firm, a boutique outfit from Vancouver that specialized in what their website called operational transformation. The lead consultant was a young guy, maybe 32, who wore slim-fit blazers and used the word frictionless approximately 4 times per meeting. I'm not exaggerating, I started counting. They started making changes. Some of them were fine, some of them were things I'd actually been asking for years. Better route optimization software, upgraded temperature sensors on the trailers. I gave credit where it was due. But some of them were dangerous. They wanted to consolidate our compliance documentation into a new cloud platform that, as far as I could tell, had never been used in a regulated cold chain environment before. I flagged this in writing. I sent emails. I asked for a meeting. The meeting happened. I laid out my concerns. The new compliance lead, another external hire, been with us about 6 weeks, told me my concerns were noted and that the transition plan had adequate safeguards. I asked her to show me the safeguards. She said they were in the documentation. I asked to see the documentation. There was a pause that lasted long enough for me to understand that the documentation didn't exist yet. I went back to my desk and wrote a memo, detailed, specific, with references to the transport regulations and the Provincial Health Authority contract terms. I sent it to my boss, to the consulting firm lead, and to our head of legal. I kept a copy for myself. That was week 2 of December. The week before Christmas, there was a company all hands. My boss gave a presentation about the coming year. She used the phrase digital first culture 7 times. She talked about agility. She talked about shedding legacy mindsets. She put up a slide that said, in large letters, experience certain expertise. I sat in the back row and stared at that slide for a long time. After the meeting, one of my younger colleagues, a logistics coordinator who'd been with us about 3 years and was genuinely sharp, leaned over and whispered, "Does she know that slide is going to end up on LinkedIn?" I didn't say anything. But later that day, sitting at my desk, I saw a post on LinkedIn from a supply chain professional in Calgary who'd screenshotted something almost identical to my boss's slide. The caption was something like, "When the MBA hire tells the guy who's kept the cold chain compliant for 2 decades that experience isn't expertise, good luck with that." There were about 400 comments. Most of them were from people who worked in operations, in trades, in logistics. People who'd been told their knowledge was a liability. I liked the post. I didn't comment, I didn't share. I just hit the little thumbs up and went back to my work. 3 days later, my boss's assistant sent me a calendar invite. The subject line was, "Alignment conversation, Hugh. No other attendees listed." That's always a sign. I walked into the boardroom at 2 o'clock on the Thursday afternoon. My boss was there, and so was our HR director, and so was a woman I'd never seen before who introduced herself as being from the legal team at Meridian. My boss said, "Hugh, we've been doing some thinking about the direction of the company, and we feel that the leadership team needs to reflect our new culture going forward." I waited. She said, "We've also become aware of some social media activity that we feel represents a misalignment with company values." I said, "A LinkedIn like." She said, "It's not just about the specific action, it's about what it signals." I looked at the HR director. He was studying the table. I said, "I've been here 19 years. I've kept this operation compliant through 2 regulatory overhauls, a global pandemic, and 3 CEO transitions. You're telling me a LinkedIn like is a cultural misalignment?" She said, "We're also restructuring the operations director role. We feel the scope needs to evolve." And that was the language. That was the tell. Restructuring. Evolve. Not, "We're letting you go," just enough corporate fog to make it feel inevitable like weather. They gave me a package. It was decent, I'll give them that. 19 weeks of severance, continuation of benefits through March, outplacement support. The woman from Meridian's legal team pushed a folder across the table. I looked at it. I didn't sign anything that day. I told them I'd have my lawyer review it. My boss looked surprised by that. I don't know why. Did she think I'd spent 19 years in compliance without learning to read a contract? I cleaned out my office that Friday. I had a mug on my desk, one of those ones your team gets you for your work anniversary, with a badly photoshopped picture of my face on it and the words 19 years and still running printed underneath. I kept that. Left everything else. I drove home. The highway was icy and the sun was already going down at 4:30 the way it does in Edmonton in December, and I sat in my truck in my driveway for a while before I went inside. My wife met me at the door. She read my face before I said a word. She put her arms around me and didn't say anything for a minute, and that was exactly right. Now here's where I need to be careful, because I want to tell this part honestly. I want to be clear, I did not sabotage anything. I did not build a kill switch. I did not plan any of what happened next. What happened next was a direct consequence of the choices my former employer made, choices I had explicitly warned them about in writing with timestamps. The week after my last day, the consulting firm completed the migration to the new compliance platform. They moved our temperature monitoring logs, our chain of custody documentation, our carrier certifications, and our provincial health authority reporting system onto this new platform over a single weekend. What they didn't fully account for was that our reporting system had a series of custom-built integrations that I had developed over years with our software vendor. Integrations that were not formally documented anywhere except in my head and in a series of notes I kept on a local server that was, as of my last day, no longer my server. I had tried to document those integrations multiple times, but every time I'd started, there'd been a crisis or a deadline, or my new boss's consulting team had said they'd handled the legacy technical debt as part of the migration. I had emails, I still have them, where I explicitly said, before you migrate, I need 2 weeks to document the custom integrations or this will break. The response I got was, we have it covered. They did not have it covered. By Wednesday of that week, the Provincial Health Authority's automated reporting portal was rejecting our submissions. At first, the new compliance lead thought it was a portal issue on their end. She spent a day and a half on the phone with the government IT team before someone finally said, no, the issue is on your end. Your authentication tokens aren't passing correctly. Authentication tokens. That was one of the custom integrations, one of the ones I built in 2018 when the health authority upgraded their reporting system and nobody else wanted to deal with the API documentation over a holiday weekend. By Friday, we had missed 4 consecutive automated compliance submissions to the Provincial Health Authority. Under our contract, that triggered an automatic flag, a flag that, if not resolved within 72 hours, would result in a formal notice of non-compliance, which would be visible to our other regulated clients. The medical supply contract alone was worth about $11 million annually. My phone rang on Saturday morning at 8 a.m. It was the CFO, a man who had always been decent to me, who had not been in that boardroom when they let me go. He'd been with the company almost as long as I had come up through the finance side. He sounded tired in the way people sound when they haven't slept. He said, Hugh, I know I'm the last person you want to hear from right now, but I need to talk to you. I said, I know why you're calling. He said, the authentication tokens. I said, yes. There was a long pause. He said, I want you to know I had no part in how this was handled. The way they let you go, I raised concerns. On record, it wasn't right. I believed him. I still do. He said, we have 72 hours before this becomes a formal non-compliance event. The health authority contact is asking for me by name, and I don't know what to tell them. The consulting firm, they're out of their depth, and the new compliance lead has never dealt with a government reporting system at this level. I said, I know. He said, I'm not authorized to offer you anything right now. I have to be honest about that. But I need to ask, is there anything you can tell me about how to fix this? Anything at all? And here is the moment I've thought about a lot since then. I could have said no. I could have hung up the phone. I could have said, you have my contact information if you want to discuss a formal consulting arrangement, and left it at that. Legally, that would have been fine. Morally, I've thought about it. But I thought about the grocery chain, about the hospital supply runs, about the people at the dock who had nothing to do with any of the decisions that had been made. My former colleagues, the coordinator who'd whispered about the LinkedIn slide, the drivers who'd been with us for a decade, the refrigeration tech who had 3 kids and had never once called in sick on a critical load. I didn't fix it for the company. I fixed it for them. I said, here's what I can tell you. Not the solution. You're going to need to bring me in formally for that. But I can tell you this, the problem is not in the new platform. The problem is in the handshake between the platform and the health authority's API. You need to look at the token refresh cycle. That's the thread to pull. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, what would it take to bring you back? And this is the part that I've been thinking about since I sat in my driveway on that December afternoon. I said, that's not a conversation you can have with me. That's a conversation the board needs to have. And before any of that conversation happens, I need a few things in writing. He said, what things? I said, first, my boss and the lead consultant are removed from any operational decision-making before I step foot in that building. Not transferred, not reshuffled, removed from operational authority. Second, I get a formal written acknowledgement that my termination was without cause and that the company waived any claims related to intellectual property developed during my tenure. Because those custom integrations were built on my personal time and my own initiative, and I want that on record. Third, any engagement going forward is as an independent contractor at a rate we negotiate before I show up. Another pause. He said, "Hugh, I can't commit to any of that." I said, "I know, that's why I said the board needs to have this conversation. I'll expect a call." I hung up and made myself a coffee. The call came at 11 a.m. It was from a number I didn't recognize. Turned out to be one of the Meridian board members calling direct. He was polite. He was clearly in crisis management mode. He did not try to minimize what had happened. He said, "We're prepared to meet your terms with some modifications on the rate." I said, "Send me something in writing. I'll have my lawyer look at it. If it's reasonable, I'll be there Monday morning." He said, "We may not have until Monday, the 72 hours. I said, "I understand the 72 hours. Send me something in writing today." The document came at 2 p.m. My lawyer, a woman I've known for years who does employment and contract work, looked it over and called me at 4. She said, "They gave you almost everything. The rate they're proposing is fair. I'd push on one clause about future non-disclosure, but otherwise this is solid." I signed it at 5 p.m. Monday morning, -18 again, and I'm standing in the parking lot of Northbridge Distribution. I'm wearing my insulated Carhartt jacket and the steel-toed boots I'd worn to 1,000 early morning inspections. I've got a travel mug of coffee from the Tim Hortons on the way over. I'm not trying to make an entrance. I'm just here to do a job. The CFO met me at the front door. He shook my hand and said, "Thank you." I said, "Let's get to work." The new compliance lead met us in the operations center. She looked like she hadn't slept in 4 days, which was probably accurate. She looked at me with an expression I recognized. It was the look of someone who had been very confident and was no longer. I didn't say anything to make her feel worse. That wasn't the point. I sat down at a terminal, walked through the API configuration, found the token refresh issue in about 40 minutes, and then spent the next 3 hours building a proper documentation file for the integration so that this would never happen again. Not because anyone asked me to, because the next person who sat in this chair deserved to understand what they were inheriting. By noon, the Health Authority portal was accepting submissions again. By 2 p.m., the backlog was cleared. By 4 p.m., I had handed the documentation to the compliance lead, explained it line by line, and told her that if she had questions, she could email me at the rate specified in my contract. Then I put my jacket back on, picked up my travel mug, and walked out. My boss was not in the building. I don't know what happened to her exactly. I heard through the CFO, weeks later, that she had transitioned out of the CEO role as part of a broader strategic realignment. Meridian's language, not mine. The lead consultant's firm was not renewed for the second phase of their contract. I did 2 more consulting engagements with Northbridge over the following months. Shorter ones, helping the new compliance lead get fully up to speed, reviewing the documentation I'd created. The relationship was professional and, I think, genuinely useful for both sides. But I never went back full-time. I didn't want to. What I wanted, and what I eventually found, was something I hadn't known I was missing: the ability to choose. To look at a situation and decide whether it was worth my time and my expertise, without the weight of 19 years of obligation pressing me into a chair. I still live in Edmonton. I still drive the same truck. My wife and I took a trip to the Maritimes last summer, something we'd been saying we'd do for 15 years and somehow never managed. We spent a week in Cape Breton, drove the Cabot Trail, ate lobster until we couldn't move. She said it was the most relaxed she'd seen me in years. She was probably right. I think about that slide sometimes. Experience, shit set eyes. I think about what the person who made that slide believed when they made it, genuinely believed, not maliciously, but with the kind of confidence that comes from never having been wrong in a way that cost them anything real. Experience and expertise aren't the same thing. That much is true. But here's what 19 years in a cold chain will teach you if you let it. Expertise is just experience that's been tested enough times to know where the edges are, and the edges are always exactly where the walls look the most solid. The foundation is the most important part of the building. The people who poured it just don't always get the credit until someone decides to start knocking walls down. I've thought about that parking lot moment more than I expected to. -18. Breath hanging in the air, standing in front of a building I'd given nearly 2 decades to. There was no dramatic music, no sense of triumph, just cold air and a travel mug going lukewarm in my hand. What I keep coming back to is this. None of what happened was accidental. Not the collapse, not the call from the CFO, not the board's sudden willingness to meet every condition I put on the table. Things don't just fall apart randomly. They fall apart at exactly the scenes where the warnings were ignored. I'd sent those emails. I'd flagged the integration risk in writing. The consequences weren't bad luck. They were a direct and predictable result of choices made by people who were certain they knew better. I don't say that with bitterness. I say it because I think it matters to understand how cause and effect actually work in the real world, not the theoretical one that gets taught in business school presentations. You can redefine someone's value with a slide deck. You can call 19 years of operational knowledge legacy thinking. But the cold chain doesn't care about your terminology. The health authority portal doesn't care about your roadmap. The API either authenticates or it doesn't. Earl used to say something I didn't fully appreciate until much later. He'd say, the most expensive thing in this business isn't equipment. It's the gap between what people think they know and what they actually know. He said it plainly, the way he said most things, and I'd nod and move on to whatever fire needed putting out. I understand it differently now. What got me through those weeks? The severance. The silence, the phone sitting on the counter while I wondered whether to answer it. Anger burns fast and leaves you emptier than before. What held me steady was something quieter. It was knowing that I had done the work honestly. Every system I built to last. Every warning I raised because it was true, not because I was trying to protect my position. When the CFO called, I helped because the people on the dock deserved better than to be collateral damage in someone else's miscalculation. That choice, to show up with integrity even when I had every reason not to, is the only part of the whole situation I'm entirely at peace with. And I think that's the thing that's hardest to teach and easiest to underestimate. You can have all the credentials in the world, but if the judgment isn't grounded in something real, in actual accountability, in willingness to be wrong, in the discipline to document what you know even when no one's asking, then the credentials are just decoration. The people who built the systems know where the edges are. They know because they've been there when things went sideways at 2 a.m. and there was no consultant on call to fix it. My wife asked me once, after all of it was done, whether I'd do anything differently. I thought about it for a while. Honestly, I'd have pushed harder on the documentation earlier. Not for the company's sake, for mine. Because knowledge that lives only in one person's head is fragile, and I knew that, and I let it slide anyway. That's on me. But the rest of it, the way I left, the conditions I set, the decision to walk back in on my own terms, I'd do all of that exactly the same. Some things you only get right by having been tested enough times to know where your own edges are. That's what 19 years actually gives you if you're paying attention.